Hey everybody, welcome back. In this episode, we're going to go over the last bit, I promise, the last bit of vocabulary we'll need for a while, but we're about to get into crafting servers, and we want to know a proper way to do that. What is a good rule to follow when crafting endpoints, making our routes that the client will almost seem intuitive. It knows what to request and where to request it. So there's different types of architecture styles when building an API. One in the past has been known as SOAP. The one that we'll be covering is REST, or RESTful API architecture, something you may have heard before. So we're going to go over these terms here just so we're aware of all the things we'll be dealing with. And then we will be able to start jumping in and building more complex servers and APIs. All right, so let's start. REST, what does it stand for? This is Representational State Transfer. And what that really means is that you want to craft your endpoints, which we'll review here in a minute, but we'll want to craft our endpoints to represent the piece of state or pieces of state that that endpoint will serve up. So if I need a request to get my users, the GET request should go to something like /users, so it's intuitive. That's what I'm going to get from my database. Now, when you're fetching data from a database, that's what these two words are for, resource and collection. Resource represents a single item in a database. And I am saying the word object here because we will be learning, eventually we'll be learning a non-relational database type called MongoDB. And that stores data, you can think about it as like JavaScript objects. It's closely related to those, so it's easy to work with. It's somewhat intuitive if you already know JavaScript. So a resource is a single item. I can go and get one user. So a collection is a collection of similar items. So I can make a request to something like /user and get a single user, or something to /users and get the entire collection of users. Right? So this is how RESTful API architecture works. We make these endpoints to represent what we're trying to get. Users should send back a collection, which you can think of as an array, and resource would be a user. We're just asking for a single object. So how do we request this data? Well, it's all through HTTP methods to HTTP endpoints, ones that we craft on our server. Now, every API, every server has a base URL. If you're thinking Google, this would be Google's base URL, right? It's just the home page name and a /. That is the base URL. Now, endpoints are crafted off of that. So let's actually use a different example here. Let's do Amazon. An API endpoint is saying, now what part from the database or databases do you need when you're making this request? So while we'd have the base URL of Amazon.com, and I'm just making this up, but let's say we're looking for movies, the API endpoint would say something like movies. Now we are extending the base URL with this /movies endpoint to denote what a GET request to this URL would give us. Now, when following RESTful API architecture, it is a good rule to stick to that nouns are greater than verbs. So I wouldn't want to make this GET request something like get movies. That's redundant. I'm already going to make a GET request to movies. So what I'll do, I'll just craft an endpoint called movies, and then I'll make different routes, maybe 4 routes. One for getting all movies, one for posting a new movie, one for updating, like a put, and a delete request. And it would all go to this endpoint. We would just build 4 different routes, one listening to each type of request, get, post, put, and delete. That would register to the movies collection in our database. Now, endpoints can get further than this. Of course, we will be extending them. Whenever you're visiting Amazon, you may see multiple things like this, where it's just letters and words and maybe something else. They can get very complex. So we're going to stick to just kind of base endpoints right now. But let's say we wanted to request a single movie. Would we change this endpoint and make another one just called movie like I did up here? And the answer is typically no. So this isn't typically one we would use. If we're requesting a single item from a collection, a resource from a collection, we would still use our /movies endpoint, but we'd extend onto it something that would listen for an ID. So this is just a random string of numbers and letters, but this would register maybe to an ID of a movie in our database. And this would be our GET request to get a single resource. So without the ID, get every item. With the ID, go get me a single movie that I'm requesting. So we'll talk about that, but we would be doing it to an ID. So what is that? So in APIs, you have something called parameters, and you may recall this from making requests on the front end to third-party APIs, where you have to send to something like /movies, and then you have to send some sort of ID number to go get that singular item. Now on the back end, and we'll have a whole lesson on this, but we craft that by giving it a parameter. Just like a function, this is a placeholder for data that we can send our server when we're making the HTTP request. The way that we denote that on the back end is by saying : and then giving it a parameter name like movie ID. On the back end, when this request came in, we would be able to fetch or receive whatever ID the user is requesting from through this parameter. And we'll talk about how. But that's how we'd be doing our GET1 requests. There are another way to pass information through a URL through something called a query or a query string. And we'll also have an entire lesson on these. But just a high level here, let's say we were requesting all movies, but we wanted to, instead of get the entire collection, we wanted to get a sub-collection. What I mean by that is, sure, we're going to have maybe fantasy and action and documentary, all those types of movies in our database. What if this user is on our site and they click a filter and they say, give me all action movies? How do we send that movie to a server, that request to a server, so it knows that we want all movies, but only if their genre is in the action segment? Well, what we would do is we'd end the URL, or the endpoint, and we would begin a query string, which starts with a question mark, and then we can give key value pairs of what we're looking for. So I could say genre equals action. On the back end, as we'll see in Express, we'll be able to retrieve this query so that when we go and search our database, for the sake of these lessons, our fake database, we can send back just the movies that have a genre of action. Now, if we needed to send more items in our query string, we can separate them with an ampersand, and maybe we'd say release year is something like 1999. All right, so that's saying go look into our database for the movies, but only return them if their genre is in the action category, and the year that they were released was 1999. Perfect. Okay, so these are all the things we're going to be talking about, learning this request response cycle. So let's just do a final review here. What is the client? That is the front end. That is the website or application they are interacting with your server and database in. The server is that intermediary. It's that thing that receives the request from the client and then performs an action, either passing it to an API, which can go talk to a database, or doing some other server-side rendering if we were building that type of application. Lastly, there are quite a few request methods, but the four most important follow that CRUD acronym. If you recall, we need get, post, put, and delete. If you think most websites you visit, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, what have you, these are the requests pretty much powering every action that you do on there. So if we can learn these four, we can build very comprehensive applications. Okay, a little practice here before we move on, building a RESTful API. Let's say our API was for a camping goods store, and we would like to craft endpoints that are sensible, easy to read when building on the front end. And so the items maybe we'd like to sell are tents, sleeping bags, cooking, and etc. Just other things that you need through camping. So how would we craft this endpoint? Well, maybe we would have a tents endpoint where we can get tents, and a sleeping bags endpoint to get those, and etc. But as our API grows, these endpoints are going to start extending. We're going to start selling equipment for tents or for camping that are much broader categories. So maybe we would actually start off with something like equipment tents and equipment sleeping bags, so that this can be extended further to all sorts of types of equipment, but it all starts with this base endpoint of equipment. Now, if we wanted a single tent, we would create another endpoint that listens for equipment /tents/ID. Same with sleeping bags. And I think you get the idea here, but this is what we're going for. We're going for readable endpoints that represents our state, right, for our representational state transfer. Now, this is a very slimmed down example, of course, but as you start crafting APIs, you want to think about this. How am I organizing it? Do my endpoints make sense for what I'm doing when I make a request to them? Okay, so that is it for our intro to RESTful API architecture. We will get a lot of practice with all these words here in further episodes, so as soon as you're ready, let's move on.